He fished islands out of the ocean. Then he tried to kill death itself. The story of Maui and the Polynesian Pacific. Across an ocean larger than every continent on Earth combined, scattered over thousands of islands separated by vast stretches of open water, one name appears again and again in story after story, told in dozens of related languages by people who navigated that ocean using nothing but stars, currents, and the flight patterns of birds. The name is Maui. In Hawaii, they say he slowed down the sun with a rope made from his sister's hair so there would be enough daylight to dry the cloth she had woven. In New Zealand, the Maori say he fished the North Island up from the ocean floor using his grandmother's jawbone as a hook. In Tahiti, in Samoa, in the Cook Islands, in Tonga, the stories shift in their details but never in their core. There was a trickster, a demigod, the last and smallest of his mother's children, who refused to accept the world exactly as it was given to him, and who spent his entire existence trying to bend it into something more generous for the people who would come after him. And then, at the very end of his story, he tried to do one final thing. He tried to make human beings immortal. He tried to defeat death itself. He failed. And the way he failed tells you almost everything you need to know about why the Pacific peoples have told this story, in some form, for well over 1,000 years, across one of the largest cultural and linguistic regions on the face of the planet. This is the story of Maui, a demigod thrown into the sea. Nearly every version of Maui's story begins the same way, and it begins with rejection. Maui was born to a mortal mother. In most tellings her name is Taranā, or a close variant of it depending on the island and the language, as the last of several sons, born prematurely, smaller and weaker than his brothers had been. And his mother, for reasons the old stories rarely soften or apologize for, looked at this small, struggling infant and decided he was not going to survive. She cut off a lock of her own hair, wrapped the baby in it, and threw him into the ocean. This should have been the end of the story before it began. But the ocean did not let him drown. In the Maori telling, the waves themselves cradled him, jellyfish and seaweed gathered around him and kept him afloat, and the great ancestor of the sky, Tamanui Karangi, or in some versions the sea god himself, found the small bundle drifting and took him in. Maui was raised not by his own family, but by the ocean and its spirits, learning things in that strange infancy that no ordinary child raised in an ordinary house ever could have learned: the moods of the tides, the language of the currents, the deep, old magic that exists at the boundary between land and sea. When he was old enough, Maui made his way back to his mother's house. He found her one night reciting the names of her sons as they each went to sleep in turn, counting them off, and when she reached the end, she did not say his name, because as far as she knew, he did not exist anymore. He had to announce himself. He had to insist, to a mother who believed she had thrown her child away to die, that he was alive, that he was hers, and that he intended to take his place among his brothers. This origin matters enormously for understanding everything Maui does for the rest of his life. He begins his existence as the one who was discarded. The youngest, the smallest, the one judged not worth keeping. And almost every feat he goes on to perform, slowing the sun, raising islands, securing fire for humanity, and finally confronting death itself, is, in some way, an answer to that original rejection. He spends his entire life proving, again and again, on a scale that eventually becomes cosmic, that the one who was thrown away was actually the most important of them all. The hook made from a grandmother's jaw. One of the most beloved and widely told Maui stories across the Pacific is the story of how he fished up land from the bottom of the sea. In the Maori tradition specifically, the great fish that became the North Island of New Zealand, which the Maori still call Te Aikea Maui, the fish of Maui, to this day. Maui's brothers, in most versions of this story, did not particularly want him along on their fishing expedition. They had grown used to a life without him, used to being the ones who mattered, and they tried repeatedly to leave him behind or exclude him from their canoe. But Maui, persistent and clever in the way he always is, hid himself in the bottom of the canoe under a mat or beneath the bilge boards, and revealed himself only once they were already far out at sea, too far to turn back and put him ashore. His brothers fished as they normally did, with ordinary hooks, catching ordinary fish, and they expected nothing more from the day. But Maui had a different plan entirely. He had gone, before this journey, to visit his grandmother, the formidable and somewhat terrifying ancestress whose name varies across tellings, but who is consistently depicted as a guardian of deep, dangerous knowledge, and from her, he had obtained a magical fishhook, carved in some versions from her own jawbone, given to him specifically because she recognized in him the same hunger to reach further than what was given. When his brothers had finished their ordinary fishing, Maui took out his hook, baited it, in the most famous version of the story, with his own blood, striking himself to provide the bait, a detail that should not be glossed over too quickly, because it tells you that what Maui pulled up from the depths cost him something real and physical from the very first cast, and threw the line down into waters so deep no one else had dared to fish there. He felt an enormous pull. He told his brothers to paddle, to keep the canoe steady, and above all, not to look back, no matter what they heard or felt. And as he hauled on the line with everything in him, straining against a weight unlike anything that had ever been caught on a hook before, the ocean floor itself began to rise. Mountains broke the surface. Valleys emerged streaming with seawater. An entire landmass, vast and dripping, was hauled bodily up out of the deep by a hook made from his grandmother's jaw and bait made from his own blood. But his brothers, terrified and disobedient, looked back. And in some tellings, they began hacking at the great fish with their own tools out of fear or excitement, cutting into the land before the proper rites could be performed to calm and bless it, which is why, the Maori say, the North Island's landscape is so dramatically uneven today, full of jagged mountains and deep valleys, scarred by the impatience of brothers who couldn't simply trust Maui and wait. This is, again, the same pattern from his birth repeating itself on a much larger scale. Maui does something extraordinary, something none of his brothers, none of the people who originally underestimated him, could have managed. And the people around him, even when benefiting directly from what he has done, still cannot quite bring themselves to trust him completely. They look back when told not to. They cut too early. They never fully believe, even with the evidence of an entire new landmass rising in front of them, that the one who was thrown into the sea as an infant might actually be the most powerful among them. Snaring the sun. Another story told across nearly the entire Polynesian Pacific, with wonderfully consistent core details from Hawaii all the way down through the Cook Islands and into New Zealand, concerns Maui's complaint with the sun itself. In the old days, the stories say, the sun moved across the sky far too quickly. The days were short and rushed. There was barely enough daylight to plant crops, to fish, to cook food properly, and, in the version most beloved in Hawaii, barely enough time for Maui's mother and the other women of the village to lay out the bark cloth they had beaten and dye it and dry it in the sun before darkness fell again and undid a full day's careful work. Maui watched his mother's frustration and decided the sun's behavior was simply unacceptable. This is, again, characteristic of him entirely. He does not pray to the sun, does not simply accept the cosmic order as fixed and unchangeable the way it had always been. He treats the sun as a problem to be solved through cleverness and effort, the same way a fisherman treats an empty net. He gathered ropes, in the Hawaiian telling, made from the strong fiber of coconut husk, and in the most famous detail of all, from the hair of his sister, cut and braided into cords strong enough for what he intended, and he traveled to the eastern edge of the world, to the pit out of which the sun rises each morning, the place called Haleakala in Hawaii, a name that itself means House of the Sun. He hid there in the dark before dawn, waiting, his ropes coiled and ready. When the sun rose, climbing up out of its pit, stretching its first long rays of the day, Maui struck. He lassoed the sun's rays one by one as they emerged, snaring leg after leg of the great fiery creature the way a hunter snares an animal at a watering hole, until the sun was caught fast, unable to pull free, unable to continue its usual fast climb across the sky. The sun, in pain and astonishment, begged for its freedom. And Maui, who had not done this out of simple malice or to torture the sun for its own sake, made a bargain. He told the sun it could go free, but only if it agreed from now on to move more slowly across the sky, to give the people below enough daylight hours to live their lives properly, to dry their cloth, to plant and harvest and fish without racing against an unfair and unbending darkness. The sun agreed. And to this day, the Hawaiian story says, the sun moves at the slower, more generous pace Maui forced it to promise, all because one demigod refused to accept that his mother and her companions should have to live their entire lives at the mercy of something moving too fast to be reasoned with, until someone finally climbed up to where it rose and reasoned with it anyway, rope in hand. Stealing fire for humanity. A third story, again told with variations across the Pacific but consistent in its essential shape, concerns how fire came to humanity, and once more, it is Maui who provides it, not as a gift handed down from generous gods, but as something taken, against resistance, on behalf of ordinary people who did not yet have it. In the Maori tradition, fire originally belonged to Mahwika, a fire goddess, often described as Maui's own ancestress, who kept the secret of flame in her own fingernails, deep within the earth or in a sacred, hidden place. Humanity at this point in the story cooked nothing, warmed themselves with nothing, lived entirely without the transformative power of fire, because it belonged exclusively to a being who had never been asked to share it. Maui went to Mahuika and asked for fire, not entirely honestly, in most versions, since he intended from the start to test exactly how far her generosity could be pushed and exploited. Mahuika, perhaps flattered, perhaps simply trusting a request from a relative, plucked one of her own burning fingernails and gave it to him as a flame to carry home. Maui, instead of carrying it carefully back to his people, deliberately extinguished it, dropping it in a stream or stamping it out, and returned, asking for another. Mahuika, slightly suspicious now but still willing, gave him a second fingernail. He extinguished that one too, and returned for a third. This continued, nail by nail, Maui testing and pushing and taking advantage of his ancestress's patience, until Mahuika, down to her very last fingernail and finally furious at being so thoroughly used, refused to give him any more and instead hurled the fire at him directly, setting the whole world around him ablaze in her rage. Maui, caught in a forest fire of his own making, had to call on other powers, rain gods in most versions, to save himself from the very fire he had been so determined to obtain, flooding the flames before they consumed him entirely. But in the end, Mahuika, even in her fury, preserved a small portion of fire by placing it into certain trees, which is why, the Maori say, those particular woods can still be rubbed together today to produce a spark, fire forever afterward hidden inside ordinary wood rather than held exclusively by a single jealous guardian, accessible now to anyone patient enough to rub two sticks together correctly. Notice the shape of this story again. Fire belonged to one being. Maui, through persistence, trickery, and a willingness to be reckless with someone else's trust and patience, ensured that fire became something distributed, something embedded into the ordinary material of the world rather than locked away in a single jealous hand. He nearly dies for it. He angers a goddess permanently. But humanity ends up with fire hidden inside every tree, forever, because of what he did. The final task, defeating death. And now we come to the last and most important story, the one that gives Maui's entire life its final, devastating shape, the one every Pacific telling eventually arrives at, because every mythology on Earth eventually has to answer the same question, and the Pacific's answer comes through this one final, audacious attempt. Maui, having raised islands from the seafloor, having slowed the sun itself, having stolen fire from a goddess and survived her fury, decided that he was not finished. He decided that the one remaining problem facing humanity, the one indignity he had not yet solved, was death itself. Every human being who had ever lived had eventually died, without exception, since the beginning of the world. Maui, who had refused to accept the speed of the sun or the scarcity of fire as simply how things had to be, refused to accept this too. In the Maori version of this final story, Maui learned that the goddess of death and the underworld, Hainui-Tiipa, the great lady of night, who in an earlier life had been the beautiful dawn maiden Haintaitama before discovering a terrible truth about her own husband and fleeing into the underworld to become its guardian and ruler, held the secret to ending death's power over humanity within her own body. The old stories say that if Maui could somehow pass through her body and emerge again from the other side without being harmed, he would reverse the order of nature itself. Rather than death swallowing the living would pass through death and emerge unharmed, and human beings would become immortal, the way the moon itself appears to die and then return each month rather than vanishing forever. Maui found Hainui-Tiipa sleeping, enormous, her body stretched out as she rested, her great form visible against the horizon, her thighs described in the old tellings as edged with teeth like sharpened obsidian or volcanic glass, a detail meant to convey both the danger and the strange, fearsome power of what he was about to attempt. He told the birds who accompanied him to stay absolutely silent no matter what happened, no matter what they saw, exactly as he had once told his brothers not to look back at the great fish rising from the sea. He stripped, intending to enter her body while she slept and travel through it and emerge from her mouth, completing the passage that would break death's permanent grip on humanity forever. He began the passage in silence. He was making progress. He was, by every indication in the old story, on the verge of succeeding at the single greatest feat any being, mortal or divine, had ever attempted. And then one of the small birds accompanying him, in most versions a fantail, a small and ordinarily cheerful bird known for its quick, fluttering movements, could not contain itself. Perhaps from nervousness, perhaps from simple instinct, perhaps from the absurdity and the tension of watching a demigod climb into the body of the goddess of death, the bird let out a small, sharp laugh. Hainui-Tiipa woke. And in waking, her body's natural and immediate response closed around Maui where he was, and the obsidian-edged teeth of her thighs did what such things do. Maui died. And because Maui died there, attempting to overturn death's power for all of humanity and failing at the final moment because of one small, involuntary laugh from a bird who could not stay silent. Death's grip over every human being who has lived since has remained exactly as absolute and exactly as permanent as it always was before he tried. What this ending actually means. I want you to sit with this ending, because it is one of the most honest endings in all of world mythology, and it is worth asking directly why an entire ocean's worth of cultures chose to end their greatest hero's story this way rather than giving him the victory his entire life of accomplishment seemed to be building toward. Every other obstacle Maui faced in his life, he overcame through persistence, cleverness, and a refusal to accept the world's limitations as final. He turned rejection into rescue. He turned an unfair sun into a slower, fairer one. He turned a jealously guarded fire into something hidden generously inside every tree. Story after story, the lesson seems to be that the world's harshest, most fixed-seeming rules are actually negotiable, if you are determined enough and clever enough to negotiate with them. And then, at the very end, he meets the one rule that genuinely is not negotiable, and he loses, not because he was insufficiently clever, not because his plan was flawed, not even really because of his own mistake, but because of something entirely outside his control. A small bird's involuntary laugh, a moment of noise in a passage that needed to remain silent. This is not a story telling you that death can be defeated if only you are brave enough and clever enough, the way so many later, more triumphant hero myths eventually become. It is a story telling you the opposite, and telling it through the only figure in the entire mythology resourceful enough to make the attempt seem genuinely plausible right up until the very last moment. If Maui, who fished up islands, who tamed the sun, who outwitted a fire goddess, could not make it through, then death truly is the one boundary that holds for everyone, regardless of how resourceful, how favored, how persistent you have been up to that point. And there is something quietly comforting hidden inside that apparent bleakness, if you sit with it long enough. The story does not say humanity deserved to remain mortal because of some moral failing, some punishment for disobedience the way so many other traditions frame death's permanence. It says, simply and almost tenderly, that a small bird laughed at the wrong moment, the way small, ordinary, uncontrollable things in life often do interrupt our largest and most determined plans, and that this is simply how the story goes, without any larger judgment attached to it. Death is not a punishment in the Maori telling of Maui's final failure. It is closer to an accident of timing, a fragile threshold that very nearly didn't hold, broken not by humanity's unworthiness but by the simple unpredictability of a small creature who could not keep quiet. Maui's brothers had once doubted him, looked back when told not to, undermined him out of fear and disbelief. At the very end, it is not a brother who undoes him, but a small, well-meaning bird, accompanying him out of loyalty, undone by nothing more sinister than a nervous laugh at the most important silence of his entire life. Why Maui still matters across an entire ocean. Maui remains, to this day, one of the most consistently beloved figures across the entire Pacific, told and retold in Hawaii, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Tahiti, in Samoa, in the Cook Islands, in Tonga, and across dozens of other island cultures connected by an ocean that for centuries was assumed by outsiders to be a barrier separating these peoples from one another, when in fact, as their shared stories prove, it was always a connector, a single vast cultural space navigated and shared long before anyone else's maps acknowledged it existed. He endures because his story tells a truth that resonates whether you live on a tiny atoll or a great volcanic island. The youngest, the smallest, the one initially discarded by his own family, can still reshape the actual physical and cosmic conditions of the world for everyone who comes after him, can still raise land from the bottom of the sea, can still bargain with the sun itself, can still wrestle fire away from a jealous guardian and scatter it generously into the wood of every tree. But he also reminds every person who has ever heard his story, across 1,000 years and 10,000 islands, that even the most resourceful being who has ever lived eventually meets the one threshold that does not bend, and that the manner of meeting it, boldly, deliberately, attempting something no one before him had ever dared to try, matters enormously, even when, especially when, the attempt does not succeed. Maui did not make humanity immortal, but he tried, fully, with everything he had, all the way to the very threshold of the goddess of death herself. And the people who have told his story for 1,000 years across an entire ocean have never once treated that failure as the end of his greatness. They have treated it as its final, most human proof. Ancient stories. Eternal truth. This has been SERA Mythology.